Hello everyone, I am Demented Kirby, and welcome to my channel, the Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. A Flight is a series where I review the latest released or upcoming sets for any and all cards that might have some sort of impact in Commander. These episodes will be done under the assumption that you've already seen all of the cards in a set and isn't meant to be a spoiler video. This video is my own analysis on the cards I feel are most useful in the Commander format. A Flight is a sampling of several brews, so in this episode I will be sampling all cards from the completely spoiled Commander 2020. If you jump to any particular section of this set review, you will find the timestamps down in the description, as well as any deck text for any commanders I've brewed that are mentioned throughout the video. If you like any of the cards I'll be mentioning, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find a link to it down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. Other ways you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. Patrons get early access to scheduled videos on YouTube, and higher tier patrons get access to the VIP section of my Discord server. You can find a link to that in the description too. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Commander 2020 finally goes back to having 5 decks instead of the 4 that Wizards randomly did some time back when quality diminished while increasing the price. This time around we have 5 decks, again in wedge colors, with 71 new cards for the Eternal card pool between all of them. So definitely an upgrade since Commander 2016. There's one new monocolored commander for each color. However, these commanders partner with an allied colored commander that forms a wedge with the former. So I'll present each pair, but I will discuss how to use each individually and then in unison. Let's start with Twin, Champion of Freedom, and Sylvar, Devourer of the Free. Trin isn't that impressive on her own, since she's just a 3/3 for 4 mana that creates a 1/1 human soldier at the beginning of your end step if you attack that turn. Even then, she's not the worst of the 5, since she can at least be used on her own, even if she's not that powerful. Sylvar is a 4/2 with Menace for 5 mana, so it's not that good at first glance. However, it's a free sacrifice outlet for humans. Since it has black, you can run Conspiracy in order to make all of your creatures humans. With enough dedication, you can make Sylvar big enough to take out an opponent in one shot. As a pair, Trin can be sacrificed to a Sylvar in a pinch, but she only makes 1 human at your end step, and Sylvar definitely wants more of them. So a deck piloted by these partners definitely needs a lot of setup and value engines if you want your commanders to shine. Next up is Haldan, Avid Arcanist, and Paco, Arcane Retriever. On his own, Haldan is useless since Paco is the only way of exiling spells with fetch counters on them, so it's basically pointless to brew a deck just around Haldan. On his own, Paco isn't that bad since it's exiling the top card of each library when it attacks, so it does provide a form of disruption. However, these are partners that you definitely want to keep together in the command zone or within the same deck in the 99, since each one can fetch up the other one. No pun intended. Since the cards are exiled with fetch counters on them, Haldan can help you cast them whenever you want and can, so it's better than Impulsive Draw. With enough effects to manipulate the top of your library, you can benefit from Paco's exiling effect in order to not lose lands or non-permanent spells you want to keep. I suggest including Rift Sweeper in the 99 just in case you exile something you'd like back. Nikata Lair Scavenger is one of the best partners in the set since you can build a deck just around her if you wanted to, since her ability is quite relevant. In fact, this is a card I'll probably include in my Mazarek Kraul Death Priest as another way to draw cards without investing in mana. So if you want to build around her with a Counters Matters Aristocrats deck or Stacks deck, she can definitely fit the bill. However, since she partners with Yannick Scavenging Sentinel, you can also include red and white for her deck's color identity. Yannick is also a partner that can work well on its own. It's a 3/3 with Vigilance for 4 mana, so it passes the vanilla test. When it enters the battlefield, you have to O-ring a creature you control, but when you do, it distributes X +1/+1 counters among any number of target creatures where X is its power. This ability is insane if you're blinking or bouncing it. Doing so returns the creature it exiled, and you can even O-ring a bigger creature each time. So you can definitely brew quite the synergistic deck just around Yannick, and blink effects with Counters Matters. However, since it partners with Nikata, you could do so in order to add a black to its color identity. Together, they can combine their strategies into quite the deck since you can give even more value to creatures with +1/+1 counters. This could definitely make for a spicy brew indeed. Brawlin Skyshark Rider partners with Shabraz the Skyshark, but she also works well on her own. You could brew a deck with tons of wheel effects and loot effects in order to make her huge. That being said, her activated ability is clearly meant to be used in unison with her partner. Shabraz can also be brewed on its own in a deck with plenty of draw effects and synergies around drawing. Since there are plenty of relevant humans, especially wizards, it can give a human flying for just 1 mana as a bonus. However, combined you can brew quite the wheels deck since most wheels are in these colors. You can also take advantage of opponents drawing and discarding via wheels and mass draw effects with cards like the Locust God, Smothering Tithe, Consecrated Sphinx, etc. Not only that, but these creatures get bigger the more you wheel, so you can also take out multiple players at once with commander damage since you have 2 different sources of commander damage. I love decks that revolve around real effects, so this is definitely a partner I'd love to brew around. Kazura Ruthless Stalker is the last mono-colored commander of the set. It can also work and be brewed on its own since he has an ability independent of his partner. So if you want to add blue and black to his color identity, add Okima Stalking Shadow to the command zone too. Okima can also be brewed on its own. It has the potential of being a great Voltron commander since it's unblockable. You can also include this as one of the 99 in Yuriko the Tiger's Shadow. In fact, that's an amazing place to put it since its ability triggers when it leaves the battlefield. You can also include plenty of blink effects in an Okima deck in order to gain life while also dealing damage to opponents. Partnered together, you can make Okima quite dangerous since green has plenty of ways of pumping creatures like Colossification. Enchanting Okima with this is insane. Other than that, just slap a bunch of Sword of X and Y to it and really go to town on opponents. This partner pair is definitely a straightforward deck, but it has the potential to really win out of nowhere. These decks are divided amongst wedge colors like half of last year's Commander Precons. We already saw the partners, so let's look at the actual tri-colored legendary creatures of the set. Cathril, Aspect Warper, and Tayam, Luminous Enigma are both Graveyard Matters commanders. Cathril gives creatures keyword counters if those keywords are present amongst creatures in your graveyard. Tayam also works with keyword counters since it gives a vigilance counter to each creature that enters the battlefield under your control. You can also pay 3 and remove 3 counters from amongst creatures you control to self-mill for 3, as well as returning a permanent from your graveyard of converted mana cost 3 or less to the battlefield. So in any case, you can return lands from your graveyard. These 2 commanders can go great together in the same deck as well as going together in other Graveyard Matters decks like Carador Ghost Chieftain. There's definitely a lot of synergy here. With Cathril, you can go for a discard or a self-mill strategy in order to get expensive creatures like Spirit of the Night, Akroma Angel of Wrath, Zetalpa Primal Dawn, etc. into your graveyard in order to give keyword counters to your creatures or to potentially reanimate them later. So there's definitely a lot of things you can do with this deck. Some great discard outlets for it include Noose Constrictor, Scourge Familiar, and Wild Mongrel, among others. You can also include Oblivion Crown as something to enchant your commander with and make them huge in a synergistic fashion. Gavi Nest Warden is the Cycling Matters commander of the set. She could pair with Akim the Soaring Wind, but not as well as Cathril and Tayam synergize. So let's see Gavi first. Obviously, you want to build the Cycling Matters deck with her. If you were to include all lands that have cycling, don't count them as the lands for your deck since they all enter the battlefield tapped. Consider most of them as draw spells. You can also include plenty of cycling interaction in the deck such as Astral Slide and Astral Drift. These pair great with creatures like Herald of the Forgotten since you can blink it to send that land cycle to the battlefield. Since there have been plenty of Cycling Matters cards over the years, you can definitely include the best ones in this deck and get quite this engines going for a very fun and intricate deck to pilot. Akim the Soaring Wind can't make tokens on its own, but when you do create tokens for the first time that turn, it creates a 1/1 bird with flying. You can then pay 6 mana to give double strike to your creature tokens. On its own, it's definitely not the ideal commander for a token deck. It could definitely be included as a support card in tokens decks within the 99, but I don't see it being all that good on its own as the commander of a deck. Otrimi the Ever Playful doesn't really pair at all with the other commander in its precon. Otrimi is similar to the other legendary creatures in Ikoria Lair of Behemoths in that it cares about mutating. So Otrimi is better suited as the commander of a Mutate Matters build. In fact, I prefer Otrimi as a black-green-blue Mutate commander than Brokos Apex of Forever from Ikoria. Otrimi triggers when it mutates, unlike Brokos, so it's definitely a better fit in a Mutate Matters deck. There are tons of great Mutate creatures for Otrimi in its colors, so it can make for quite the deck. What's great about the Mutate mechanic is that if you blink a mutated creature, it returns to the battlefield in pieces. So that's some great tech when a large pile of mutations gets targeted with removal, or if you want to go wide instead of going tall. Zaxara the Exemplary is the other black-green-blue legend of the set and is more catered to X spells and tokens, so it doesn't really synergize with Otrimi. That being said, Zaxara is great. Whenever you cast a spell with an X in its cost, you create a 0/0 Hydra with that many +1/+1 counters. So not only can you brew a Hydra tribal deck with Zaxara, including the best Hydras as well as Gargoyle's Vicious Watcher, but you can also take advantage of the best X spells in its colors such as Stroke of Genius, Blue Sun Zenith, and Pull from Tomorrow as amazing draw X spells or game-ending spells like Death Cloud, Exsanguinate, and Villainous Wealth. So you can have quite the interesting deck with tons of fast ramp like Dorks, Rocks, and land ramp spells, some Hydras and X spells, plus all the pertinent disruption pieces like counter magic and removal. You can make quite the spicy brew indeed. Jirina Kudro is the human tribal lord commander of the red-white-black precon. Hers is a pretty straightforward brew by brewing a human tribal deck. However, there are plenty of other ways to brew her as well, since humans come with plenty of known tribal classes as well, such as clerics, soldiers, and knights. So you could potentially build a human tribal deck with some sub-tribes as these and really make an interesting deck, since there are plenty of great lords for these classes. Calcian the Plague is the 6th commander that can work with experience counters. Fortunately, you could also include Daxos the Return and Kalemne, Disciple of Iroas, in the 99 of the deck. Something you can definitely want to give Calcian is Death Touch, since he is a pinger. So some cards to consider are Death Touch equipment like Basilisk Collar, Gorgon Flail, Gorgon's Head, and Quietus Spike. The first 3 are the best ones since they're cheap to cast and equip when compared with the Spike, but it's best to have all of them for consistency's sake as well as redundancy. There's also plenty of ways to give Death Touch like Archetype of Finality and Vault of the Archangel. These might be for later in the game, but it's still ways of giving Calcian Death Touch. Either way, he's great at sniping mana dorks, so you might not always need to give him Death Touch. Even then, you also want to be able to activate him multiple times in a turn, so you might want to consider adding cards like Thorn by Staff in order to untap Calcian every time he kills a creature. Sword of the Power Runes can also be used to untap him multiple times, but requires 3 mana each time to do so. Including Kalemne and Daxos are just more ways to both gain experience counters as well as taking advantage of them. So you could also include a couple of proliferate effects like Karn's Bastion, Contagion Clasp, and Contagion Engine to keep proliferating those experience counters. However, clearing the field with Calcian will also make him incredibly huge, possibly enough to take out an opponent unopposed once he is. So keep that in mind as well. Calamax the Stormsire doesn't really synergize with the other commander in the deck, but that's fine since they're both good enough to brew around individually. Calamax is interesting since it's specific to instants instead of instants and sorceries. That might seem odd, but there's plenty of instants to take advantage of its copy ability, especially card drawing instants like Return of the Wild Speaker, Stroke of Genius, etc. It's implied that you have to attack with Calamax first in order to copy the instant since it has to be tapped, but that's not necessarily the case. You could have tapped it down for another reason in order to copy the spell if you don't want to attack with him. Maybe you had Wart, the Raid Mother, in play and you tapped him down to Conspire, or maybe it was an instant with Convoke or Improvise. So there's plenty of ways to build around Calamax. Cyrus, the Writhing Storm, is a commander I would brew around mass draw effects as well as wheels. You could add cards like Fascination, Prosperity, and Scry Scribing in order to create a ton of creature tokens, since you'd be creating almost thrice as many tokens as what you paid for X. Folio of Fancies is another card you could include in order to have a more repeatable mass draw X cards effects. You could also include all the best blue and red wheels like Wheel of Fortune, Wheel Fall, etc. to disrupt opponents as well as getting tokens from it. You could even create even more tokens thanks to having the Locust God on the battlefield when you do. Having Perforos God of the Forge in the 99 makes death even swifter for all of your opponents once you create that impossibly large army of tokens. You can also include cards like Doubling, Season, Primal Vigor, etc. to duplicate even more tokens to really go for the kill. Having access to green means that you can also have all of the mana acceleration advantage that the Locust God deck lacks because of it. So it's even easier to sink in way more mana into those mass draw spells thanks to it. Alright, now let's break down the rest of the cards by colors, starting with white. Avenging Hunt Bonder is a 3/3 with double strike for 5 mana. In and of itself, that's a bit bad, but whenever it attacks, it puts a double strike counter on another target attacking creature. This is a great ability since the new creature will have double strike even if Avenging Hunt Bonder leaves the battlefield. If you have multiple combat steps, that you can do this multiple times in a single turn as well. Definitely a great card for decks that like combat tricks. Call the Copper Codes can get you a ton of 1/1 soldier creature tokens if targeting opponent with a ton of creatures. However, with investing a bit more mana, you can get even more creatures. This is definitely a great card for Tokens Matters decks. Likewise, you can also cast this during combat in response to blockers and be able to chump attackers. With an Aristocrats deck, this will hurt opponents a ton when your weenies die at the end of combat. So this card is definitely an amazing addition in plenty of decks and types of decks. Cartographer's Hawk is insultingly slow. In order to ramp you up planes, it has to successfully deal combat damage to a player who controls more lands than you, and even then, the bird returns to your hand afterwards. Mono White has better ramp cards from even standard sets from the past like Knight of the White Orchid and Core Cartographer. Sure, these needs to be blinked in order to abuse their abilities, but both of them ramp you up planes with way less hoops to jump through than Cartographer's Hawk. It would have been a better design if the Hawk ramped upon entering the battlefield but self-bounced when hitting an opponent with more lands. That would have made it infinitely better, but I digress. This Manaling Wave is a great disenchant since you could potentially take out 3 artifacts and or enchantments. It is a bit expensive to cycle in order to destroy all artifacts and enchantments, but keep in mind that this would be an instant speed and you'd be drawing a card too. Besides, there's plenty of ways of cheating cycling costs, so this would be perfect in the right deck. Flawless Maneuver is an amazing response spell since you can cast it for free in order to protect your board state. That being said, even if you don't control your commander, it still only costs 3 to give all of your creatures indestructible and instant speed, which is nothing to scoff at. Herald of the Forgotten is more of a ramp creature than Cartographer's Hawk, and that's sad since the Herald costs 8 mana to cast. At least it's a 6/6 with flying to compensate for the cost. Why does it ramp harder than Cartographer's Hawk? Because when it enters the battlefield, any number of permanent cards in your graveyard hit the battlefield. So any lands you cycled away go to the battlefield. However, it's not just limited to lands, you can also cheat onto the battlefield any creatures or other permanents with cycling in your graveyard. This card is definitely amazing in a Cycling Matters deck and can be quite the finisher when built around. Martial Impetus is a great way to get rid of utility creatures by forcing them to attack a player other than you, but it's also a great way to prevent a huge creature or commander from attacking you as well. Not only that, but it pumps all creatures that are attacking your other opponents with it too. So it's definitely an amazing combat trick card for decks like Primacon Sky Rampart and Marisi Breaker of the Coil to help finish off games quickly. It can also be included in Corona the False God as redundant ways of including the vows, since these also prevent Corona from attacking you. Verge Rangers is a nerfed Courser of Crufix. Sure, it's in white, which is why it won't ramp as well as green. However, it's not accelerating the lands you can play per turn. It just allows you to play lands from the top of your library, and even then, only if an opponent controls more lands than you, so you're just revealing the top card of your library to the table more often than being able to take advantage of it. Honestly, the mono-white quote-unquote ramp effects of this set are severely lacking and insulting, especially considering that there are already pre-existing cards with better effects in white's color identity. But again, I digress. Vitality Hunter is a sweet card since it gives lifelink to X creatures when it becomes monstrous. The great thing about that is they're lifelink counters, so those creatures will still have lifelink even if Vitality Hunter leaves the battlefield. Since it's a monstrous effect, that also means that Vitality Hunter will be huge afterwards as well. And it has lifelink, so you don't need to give it a counter. You can distribute it amongst your other creatures. This is definitely a great card for decks that care about gaining life or with counter hijinxes. As for blue, we have Crystalline Resonance, which is a great card in a Cycling Matters deck. It can become any permanent on the board until your next turn, which isn't limited to non-lands. That means you can use it to copy a Gaia's Cradle or other utility lands. You could also copy someone's Eldrazi Titan or other fatty, not to mention any other amazing artifacts or enchantments they might control. You can also copy your own effects. The possibilities are just endless with this card, which makes it so good in a Cycling Matters deck. Decoy Gambit is a bit dicey since it depends on opponents choosing, which can sometimes blow up in your face. If you want to bounce a creature, they might just have to draw a card instead. However, if your hand has few to no cards, they might just bounce the creature to deprive you of draws. That doesn't mean that this card doesn't have its situations, but it's just that, too situational a card, for my tastes at least. There are better draw spells and bounce effects for that mana cost. Aeon Frolicker is definitely a spicy card indeed. You can be political with it and use it to give an opponent an extra turn to help take care of an arch enemy on the table. Even then, you get protection from that player in case they break any deals or promises. However, if you want a 5/5 flyer for 4 mana that gives you protection from that player until your next turn, make sure to cast Aeon Frolicker with either Stranglehold or Ugin's Nexus on the battlefield. This prevents that opponent from their extra turn, but you still get all the benefits from Aeon Frolicker. Ethereal Forager is a 3/3 flyer for 6 mana, but it has Delve. In this case, you really want to cast it with Delve because of its triggered ability. When it attacks, you get to return an instant or sorcery from exile to your hand if you exile with it. It's a bit slow if you just want to recover instants and sorceries with it, but it is a 3/3 flyer for 2 mana that can return instants and sorceries to your hand, so it's still a great card in a spell-slinging deck. However, the way it's worded means that it's not just exile from delving, so if you mutate Illuna Apex of Wishes onto it and exile instants and sorceries from your library this way with it, you can still recover an instant or sorcery from exile this way whenever it attacks. That's some spicy tech indeed. Fierce Guardianship is essentially a free negate if you control a Planeswalker. This card is going to be busted in so many decks. This is definitely going to be one of the more expensive cards from the Commander sets. Any free counter spell is great, and this one just requires your Commander to be on the battlefield, which is what most players have anyways. So this goes pretty much in every CEDH deck except Selvala, Isan, and Godo because they don't have blue. Nascent Metamorph is a great card in that it can do many things. The obvious one is taking the risk of having to reveal a fatty from an opponent's deck in order to smash face really hard as early as turn 2 or 3. So if you're facing against an Eldrazi tribal deck, that would be probably the first opponent to go after. However, you could also use it to disrupt opponents. For example, if an opponent manipulated the top of their deck with whatever effect, you can attack with the Metamorph to disrupt what they just did. This is definitely an interesting design and I love it. Psychic Impetus is the blue card of this cycle, but the creatures get +2/+2 instead and you scry 2 whenever it attacks. This is great if you're able to move auras around, since you can get its effect each combat. So Crown of Ages, a flipped Kitsune Mystic, and Simic Guildmage are the best cards for this strategy of moving around the Impetus auras. Souvenir Snatcher is a bit expensive at 5 mana, but it is a 4/4 flyer. However, it's more expensive to mutate it, which is what the card wants to do. That being said, in a Mutate Matters deck, you can definitely take advantage of it to deprive opponents of their mana rocks. It's an expensive effect by the time you're mutating it, often getting more mana rocks is just more win more. So you're better off just stealing utility artifacts at that point. Tidal Barracuda is a global leyline of anticipation, but then prevents opponents from casting things during your turn. This is a great card for group hug decks like Feldergrift and the Meletis Kings, since you're helping out the table without being interrupted in your own turn. It will also help you close out the game once you get your win con set up, since you can't be interrupted by spells during your turn. Alright, onto the black cards. Boneyard Mycodrax has power and toughness equal to other creature cards in your graveyard. Since it's a star power and toughness, this is true regardless of where it is in the game, meaning that if you scavenge it, it gives that amount of +1/+1 counters to whatever creature it targets. Even though this can be useful in plenty of graveyard shenanigans decks, it's even better in dedicated decks like Varol's Zasar Scribed. With Varol's on the battlefield, it only costs 3 to scavenge Boneyard Mycodrax thanks to his ability. Daring Fiend Bonder is a good way to put pressure on opponents, but can then give an indestructible counter on target creature from your graveyard. This is an excellent way to protect your commander from destruction and lethal damage since it's a counter, so it's definitely a great addition in black decks that don't have many ways of giving indestructible or are just looking for many synergistic ways of doing so. Deadly Rollick is easily one of the best removal spells I've seen in quite some time. You can essentially exile any creature for free so long as you control your commander. Even if you don't, it's still 1 mana more than Murder, which just destroys the creatures. In decks with partner commanders, this is great since you have 1 of 2 potential creatures to have in order to take full advantage of it. Directional Mire is an amazing spell. Not only is this card great in mill decks like Phoenix God of Deception, but stacks decks like Corvold Fakehurst King, where you're constantly having opponents sacrifice creatures. You can take so much advantage out of this card in so many different decks. The only drawback is that opponents have to choose the creature, but people don't often play bad cards in their deck. Either way, it's 3 creatures for 4 mana, which is a great trade-off. Mind Leecher is a 5/5 flyer for 6 mana, but its mutate cost is cheaper. When it does mutate, you exile the top card of each opponent's library, and you can then play them as long as they're exiled. Since this is a delayed trigger, you can still play them even if Mind Leecher or the creature it's mutated on leaves the battlefield. This is definitely a great card to include in the Mutate Matters deck. Netherborn Altar is an auto-include in decks with Phage the Untouchable and Hakon Stromgald Scourge. You can't cast these commanders from the command zone, so it's crucial to get them into your hand any way possible. And this artifact can do so many times as you need, so you lose 3 life cumulatively, but it's worth it. You can also use this for decks with high-costed commanders if you'd then be able to cheat them from your hand. But those 2 are the commanders that most stood out to me as really needing this card in the 99. Parasitic Impetus is the black card of the cycle. You drain its controller for 2 life during each of their turns. It also gives the creature +2/+2, so it makes them more dangerous while also making them more resilient. I'd say this cycle is amazing in Corona the False God, and I'll probably say the same exact thing for the other 2 cards left in the cycle. Species Specialist is an interesting modular lore. Whenever a creature of the chosen type dies, you may draw a card. This card can go great in so many aristocrat decks that have a tribal theme. In order to make this card worth a slot in your deck, you certainly have to build your deck a certain way, but it is quite the value engine. Titan Hunter is an interesting way to deal 4 damage to a player each turn. It's also a sacrifice outlet for gaining life, albeit not a free one. It's not a bad card, but it can only really go in fringe decks and decks that might build around it since its effects aren't that impacting in commander games. Let's see what the set has in store for red. Agitator Ant is similar to Orzhov Advocus, except in this case the creatures are goated as well. This is a good political tool, but since it's red, it's more aggressive politics. I could definitely see this in Pramikon and Marisi, as mentioned earlier, as well as decks with Thantis the Warweaver. Decks where combat is forced is great since their creatures have to attack, so they might as well be bigger in order to survive that forced combat. And creatures that can attack you, Thantis gets bigger and makes them regret their actions. Deflecting Swat is a free misdirection without having to exile cards from your hand because misdirection can also be free. You just have to have a commander on the battlefield. Another thing to notice about the way these cards are worded is that it doesn't specify your commander. So if you take control of another player's commander, you're also able to cast any of these spells in this cycle for free. That's something to keep in mind as well. Fireflux Squad is an interesting polymorph effect since it triggers when you attack and don't have to pay anything else other than exile another target attacking creature. This would be amazing with tokens since you can exile a lowly token to cheat in an actual creature for attacking. If you're manipulating the top of your library, then it's even better. You can also use this after sealing an opponent's creature in order to exile it when you attack with it. So this card is great in many different situations. It's also a 4/3 with haste for 4 mana, so it passes the vanilla test. Frontier Warmonger is an effect similar to Kahiji Honored One, where it prizes your opponents for attacking each other instead of you. This is definitely a great card to have out when someone else is the arch enemy. If you're playing a deck where you're controlling who can be attacked or forcing attacks, then this is a card you might consider for such a deck. Lavabrink Floodgates is a very interesting mana rock. It costs 4 and can tap for double red. The catch? Opponents can conspire against you to deprive you of this mana rock. However, if it reaches 3 or more doom counters, it gets sacrificed and deals 6 damage to each creature. So this can be a political board wipe. It's definitely a fun card and will definitely spark banter and deals left and right. Molten Echoes is a crazy good token generator for tribal decks. It makes the tokens for free. This card is just insane in so many decks. It can be on the higher end of the curve in Edgar Markov, as well as a great card in fringe dragon tribal decks like the Dragon. With a very fast Edgar Markov deck, you can have 3 vampires for the price of 1 each time. That's beyond busted. With the Dragon, it makes it worth it casting those huge dragons since you get 2 of them each time. You can also include this in Goblin tribal decks like Zadahedron Grinder and Grenko Mob Boss. It's just an overall amazing card and can definitely be an auto-include in tribal decks that can include it. Shiny Impetus is probably the best one in the cycle since it creates a treasure token every time the enchanted creature attacks. This is a great way for mono-red decks as well as red-white decks to generate mana acceleration as well as doing other things simultaneously such as forcing creatures to attack. Spellpire Phoenix is definitely a card for Cycling Matters decks since both of its triggered abilities depend on cards with cycling. Obviously, this is meant to work with the face commander of the Cycling Matters precon, but it's still a great card to include in your own Cycling Matters decks if you brew one that's different from Gavi. Surly Badgersaur is another Bone Miser but with different effects for discarding cards. This is definitely a great card to pair with Nekasar the Mind Razor wheel decks as well as my Kaidel plus a Kiwi partner deck dedicated to rocks and wheels since wheeling with this one on the battlefield creates a ton of rocks. You can also get rid of creatures if it's big enough since it fights creatures whenever you discard non-land, non-creature cards. It's definitely a great card in decks with discard shenanigans. Okay, so now we've reached the final stretch of monocolored cards, green. Capricopian is an amazing Hydra since it costs just 1 green and X in order to get X +1/+1 counters on it. What's great about it is that you're essentially playing hot potato with it when it attacks. For just 2 mana, the defending player can redirect it to attack someone else. When they do, it gets bigger. This is definitely a fun card and a black bordered minigame every now and again is great for the format. Curious Herd is a great way to take advantage of that Artifact Matters player, and this is something Green has been doing ever since Antiquities. In this case, you're creating a 3/3 beast for each artifact that player controls. This might be a meta call in some decks, but it's definitely a game ender when cast against that artifact player. Glade Muse is a group hug effect similar to the previously mentioned Tidal Barracuda. In fact, you might want to try and avoid having them together in order to not give too many advantages to opponents. In any case, whenever anyone plays a spell outside of their turn, they draw a card. So definitely include this in your own deck if you're going to be slinging more spells than anyone else at the table. Or if Leyline of Anticipation and or Vidalcan Orrery is in your deck. But giving cards to your opponents is a dangerous thing, so tread lightly. Obscuring Haze is a free one-sided fog if you control your commander. This is great if you want to be able to kill your opponent's creatures but want yours to survive. So it's definitely great in decks with plenty of combat hijinkses. Predatory Impetus is to me the weakest one in the cycle. It costs 5 to cast and all it does is pump the creature +3/+3. You don't get any bonuses for it attacking. Even if I'm brewing Corona the False God and including this cycle in for consistency's sake, I might pass on including this one. Ravenous Gigantotherium has Devour 3, which is pretty big if you include this in a Tokens Matters deck. Not only that, but it has an effect similar to Polukranos World Eater, where it distributes damage equal to its power to any number of creatures, but then those creatures deal damage equal to their power to it. If you're able to give it Death Touch, you can potentially wipe the board as well as making sure it survives. Just soul bond it to Nightshade Peddler when it enters the battlefield. That way it gets Death Touch when it enters the battlefield in order to really make it deadly. Sawtusk Demolisher is a recurable beast within but tamer since it can't hit creatures. That being said, it's amazing in a Mutate Matters deck since it's also a 6/6 trampler that only costs 4 to mutate, so it can definitely be quite the beater as well as removal engine. Selective Adaptation is a way to cheat a creature from the top 7 cards of your library, but it has to have a keyword specified in the text. With top deck manipulation, you can very easily cheat in a beast of a creature like Zetaba Primal Dawn or Spirit of the Night. It's a bit overcosted at 6, so this is better used to cheat in expensive cards like those previously mentioned or other ones like Drogskull Reaver or either a Chroma. This card is thus very limited in its uses, but in decks where it fits, it's amazing. Slippery Bog Bonder is definitely a nod to Modern and Boggles, since Slippery Boggle is only in 367 out of 81,426 decks on EDH Rec, so it's practically in 0% of decks. It also has an art similar to its Ultimate Masters reprint. In any case, it has flash and hexproof, which is great. However, when it enters the battlefield, it can give a hexproof counter to a creature, as well as being able to transfer any amount of counters from any amount of creatures you control onto a single creature. So it can very quickly change your strategy from going wide to going tall all in an instant. Definitely a great card for a ton of counters matters decks like Mazarek Kraul Death Priest, Atraxa Praetor's Voice, etc. So unlike Slippery Boggle, Slippery Bog Bonder would find many homes in EDH. Okay, now let's see those colorless spells that can go inside any deck. Bonder's Ornament is basically the love child of Manalith and Jayamnam Toll. However, when you activate it to draw a card, anyone else controlling one draws a card too. For its casting cost and the cost to draw cards off of it, there's honestly better options. I'd rather have a Signet than this card, to be honest. Cryptic Trilobite is given the Eldrazi treatment on its frame even though it isn't an Eldrazi. This can definitely go in Counters Matters decks in order to generate a ton of mana from it. Granted, it can only be used to activate abilities, but in a deck like Burrow of the Hulklade, he can double the amount of counters on it, as well as artifacts like Gemstone Array. So even though the Trilobite's mana can't be used to cast spells, you can use it to sink into Gemstone Array and generate any kind of mana that way, as well as using it to activate any other cards. Manascape Refractor is an amazing mana rock, which is why it enters the battlefield tapped. It has all the activated abilities of all lands on the battlefield. Sanctuary Blade is an interesting equipment since you can give equipped creature +2/+0 as well as protection from any color. This is a decent way to grant protection to creatures while also changing it and not relying only on a single color for the duration of the match. Twinning Staff is insane and one of the cards I want most in this set. On its own, it doesn't do much unless you have 7 mana to sink into it. However, combined with something like Mirari, for just 3 additional mana, you just copy the spell twice instead of once. So the effect of that spell is thrice on the stack. This also goes great with commanders like Wart the Raid Mother and Wiku of 2 Reflections, since it amplifies their effect for free just for being on the battlefield. This card is just crazy and definitely an auto-include in spell-slinging decks that copy spells. Alright ladies and gentlemen, we've reached the final sampling of this flight, the lands. There's really only one new land in the set, and that's Nesting Grounds. This land is amazing in Counters Matters decks as well as Super Friends decks. If you have that Planeswalker that's just 1 loyalty away from going ultimate, you can move a loyalty counter from one other Planeswalker in order to do so. If you have Doubling Season out, then you are effectively doubling the counter moved. When you move a counter, you are removing it from one place and adding it to another place. So this effect is replacing with Doubling Season into putting twice as many. Same goes with Pure Imaginative Rascal. He adds 1 more counter of that type. So with him on the battlefield, activating Nesting Grounds would put 2 of that moved counter onto the new target. That's even more value than what the card already does. Thus concludes this flight of cards from Commander 2020. I hope this episode has been informative for you, even though there are clearly my own opinions and views on the cards herein discussed. If you have any opinions or thoughts of your own on these cards, or if I overlooked any other hidden gems for Commander, let me know in the comments. As for my predictions for this set, I was wrong in that the decks would each be dedicated to mechanics in Ikoria, but I was right in that there would be dedications to some mechanics, being that there's a cycling dedicated commander, as well as a human tribal commander. I want to take this opportunity to thank my patrons by giving a shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the Brewers, for their patronage. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of A Flight on the Commander Tavern. I am Demented Kirby, and happy theory crafting.